It all began with a single line that millions of people can still quote decades later. "Don't mention the war." It was supposed to be a joke. Instead, it became one of the most controversial moments in television history. A scene so bold that it ignited furious complaints, divided audiences across Europe, and sparked debates that continue nearly 50 years later. Some viewers called it comedic genius. Others believed it crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Streaming platforms would later remove it. Television executives questioned whether it should ever air again. And at the center of it all stood one frantic hotel manager whose greatest talent was turning every situation into complete disaster. But here's the strange part. The controversy wasn't born from hatred or malice. It grew out of satire, a style of comedy that forces audiences to laugh while feeling deeply uncomfortable. The more Basil Fawlty tried not to offend his guests, the more spectacularly he humiliated himself. That contradiction is exactly why one unforgettable episode continues to divide opinion long after countless other sitcoms have faded into history. Yet to understand why that single scene caused such an uproar, we have to go back years before Fawlty Towers ever appeared on television. Long before awards, iconic catchphrases, and sold-out reruns, there was an ordinary seaside hotel where reality proved stranger and funnier than fiction. In 1970, the cast of Monty Python's Flying Circus checked into a small hotel in the English town of Torquay. They expected little more than somewhere to sleep after filming. Instead, they stumbled into what felt like a surreal comedy sketch that no writer could have invented. The hotel's owner, Donald Sinclair, treated his guests less like paying customers and more like suspicious intruders. Every harmless action seemed to trigger another bizarre outburst. If someone left a suitcase unattended, Sinclair assumed it contained a bomb. Rather than ask who owned it, he simply picked it up and hurled it over a garden wall. When another guest used his knife and fork differently than Sinclair preferred, the hotel manager marched over to correct his table manners as though he were disciplining a child. The more absurd the behavior became, the more fascinated one particular guest grew. John Cleese couldn't stop watching. Most people would have complained about the terrible service and never returned. Cleese saw something entirely different. Beneath Sinclair's impossible personality was the perfect comic character, a man convinced he possessed elegance, intelligence, and authority while proving the exact opposite every few minutes. Years later, together with his wife and writing partner Connie Booth, Cleese transformed those unforgettable memories into Basil Fawlty. The similarities weren't accidental. Basil inherited Sinclair's paranoia, explosive temper, social awkwardness, an astonishing inability to recognize that he was usually the source of every problem. Every guest became a potential enemy. Every inconvenience became a personal attack. Every attempt to appear sophisticated somehow ended in humiliation. The brilliance wasn't that Basil was rude. Television had already seen rude characters. The brilliance was that Basil genuinely believed he was the smartest person in every room, while audiences could clearly see he was the least capable. Watching him spiral from confidence into catastrophe became irresistibly funny because viewers always knew disaster was only seconds away. When Fawlty Towers premiered in 1975, however, not everyone understood what Cleese and Booth were trying to accomplish. Several critics dismissed the series as chaotic and exhausting. Some argued the pacing was too frantic. Others couldn't understand why the main character behaved so irrationally. To them, the hotel felt like pure madness without purpose. Ordinary viewers saw something completely different. They recognized a comedy built on pressure. Every episode worked like a tightly wound spring. Tiny misunderstandings snowballed into impossible situations. Innocent mistakes became personal disasters, and Basil's desperate attempts to maintain control only accelerated the chaos. The supporting cast made that chaos even richer. Sybil Fawlty, with her razor-sharp tongue, could dismantle Basil's oversized ego using only a single sentence. Polly quietly solved problems that Basil had created while pretending he deserved the credit. Then there was Manuel, The endlessly optimistic waiter whose misunderstandings transformed simple conversations into explosions of confusion. Each character reflected a different side of Basil's personality. Sybil exposed his insecurity. Polly highlighted his incompetence. Manuel magnified his impatience. Together, they created a pressure cooker where every episode felt like it might completely collapse at any second. Ironically, despite becoming one of Britain's most beloved sitcoms, Fawlty Towers almost disappeared after its very first season. BBC executives weren't convinced it had a future. The show's unconventional pace confused many decision-makers, and for a time, it looked as though Basil Fawlty's disastrous hotel would close its doors forever. But audiences refused to let it vanish. Word spread slowly. Reruns attracted larger crowds. Viewers introduced friends and family to the strange little sitcom they couldn't stop talking about. What had once seemed like an odd experiment gradually became essential television. Then, just as the series reached legendary status, one episode changed everything. It wasn't simply another hotel disaster. It wasn't another argument with Sybil. And it certainly wasn't another misunderstanding involving Manuel. Instead, it became the episode that would force Britain to confront a far bigger question. Where does comedy end, and where does offense begin? The answer arrived with a group of German tourists. The moment the German guests walked through the doors of Fawlty Towers, Basil Fawlty should have known the safest thing he could do was stay quiet. Instead, he made a promise that television history would never let him forget. Don't mention the war. It sounded simple enough. He repeated it to his staff with complete confidence, determined that nothing would embarrass his hotel or offend his visitors. After all, Britain and Germany had spent decades rebuilding their relationship after the Second World War, and Basil desperately wanted to appear cultured, respectable, and in control. The problem was that Basil Fawlty had never been particularly good at controlling himself. Moments later, the impossible began unfolding before the audience's eyes. Trying far too hard to avoid discussing the war, Basil became obsessed with it. Every conversation pulled him closer to the very subject he was trying to escape. The more he fought against saying the wrong thing, the more his mind filled with awkward references, nervous jokes, and increasingly ridiculous attempts to recover. Then came the scene that transformed an ordinary sitcom episode into one of the most debated moments in British television. After suffering a concussion earlier in the story, Basil's already fragile judgment completely unraveled. His frantic efforts to impress the German guests spiraled into an absurd imitation of Adolf Hitler, complete with exaggerated marching, frantic gestures, and a string of World War II references that left everyone in the room frozen between shock and disbelief. For a few viewers, it was outrage disguised as comedy. For millions of others, it was comedy exposing outrage itself. That distinction would become the center of a debate that still refuses to end. The brilliance of the episode wasn't that it mocked Germany. It didn't. The real target was standing right in front of the audience. Basil Fawlty wasn't portrayed as clever, patriotic, or heroic. He was presented exactly as he'd always been, a man trapped by his own arrogance, convinced he understood situations that were completely beyond his control. Every offensive remark he made immediately backfired. Every attempt to appear sophisticated only made him look more ridiculous. The audience wasn't laughing with Basil. They were laughing at him. John Cleese understood that difference perfectly. Throughout Fawlty Towers, Basil represented a certain kind of British insecurity. He desperately wanted to impress wealthy guests, admired social status he could never quite reach, and often covered his own embarrassment with sarcasm, bluster, and misplaced confidence. The Germans simply pushed those flaws further than ever before. Comedy scholars would later describe the episode as satire aimed at Britain's inability to let go of wartime thinking. Basil wasn't attacking German visitors. He was exposing how absurd it looked when someone remained psychologically trapped in conflicts that had ended decades earlier. But satire depends on interpretation. Not everyone interpreted it the same way. As the episode aired, letters began arriving at the BBC. Some praised its fearless humor. Others condemned it as insensitive. Critics argued that jokes involving Adolf Hitler and the Second World War could never be harmless, regardless of intention. Families who had lived through the conflict viewed certain moments with genuine discomfort. For them, memories of bombings, occupation, and unimaginable loss weren't distant history. They were deeply personal experiences. Inside the BBC, executives suddenly faced an uncomfortable dilemma. Should artistic intent outweigh public outrage? Or had one of Britain's most successful sitcoms finally gone too far? Discussions reportedly became heated. Some believed the episode should quietly disappear from future broadcasts. Others argued removing it would completely misunderstand the joke itself. In the end, the BBC chose not to ban the episode. But the controversy never truly disappeared. Instead, it waited. Decades later, when streaming services brought classic television to global audiences, the Germans found itself at the center of an entirely new cultural battlefield. Viewers who had never experienced Britain in the 1970s encountered Basil's infamous performance through modern eyes. Social attitudes had changed dramatically. Comedy itself had evolved. Material once accepted as satire was now examined through the lens of representation, historical trauma, and cultural responsibility. Some streaming platforms decided the safest solution was simple. They removed the episode altogether. Others edited certain scenes before making it available. Almost instantly, another argument exploded. Supporters accused platforms of rewriting television history. They argued that removing controversial material erased opportunities to understand how comedy had evolved. Critics responded that preserving history didn't require celebrating jokes many now considered offensive. Once again, Fawlty Towers had become more than entertainment. It had become evidence in a much larger conversation about censorship, artistic freedom, and whether old comedy should be judged by modern standards. John Cleese had little patience for that debate. Never known for avoiding controversy, he defended the episode with the same sharp wit that had created it decades earlier. His argument was remarkably consistent. People, he insisted, had misunderstood who the joke was aimed at. Basil Fawlty wasn't a role model. He wasn't the hero. He was the fool. Every ignorant comment exposed his own stupidity rather than validating it. According to Cleese, removing the episode meant missing the entire point of satire itself. Whether audiences agreed or disagreed, one thing became impossible to deny. A sitcom consisting of only 12 episodes had somehow created one of television's longest-running cultural arguments. And remarkably, that wasn't even the end of the story. Behind the laughter, behind the controversy, and behind Basil's unforgettable meltdowns, the people who created Fawlty Towers were fighting battles of their own, ones the audience never saw until long after the camera stopped rolling.